Your vote is worth exactly $1,730.27. There are many reasons to vote: ethical, social, gustatory. But what if you're the kind of person who only cares about cold, hard cash? Can we put a price on just how much money is really at stake for a single vote? See, I think that many people assume that it's almost nothing, because the chances that your single vote actually decides the election are pretty darn tiny. What is it, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion? Who cares, it's just 1 in some huge number, right? But I think that sometimes people fail to appreciate the counterbalance to this tiny probability: the sheer size of the federal budget. In 2023, the government spent upwards of $6.1 trillion. That's another huge number. Now, the whole budget probably isn't at stake in every election, but how much of it is? $220 million? $33 billion? A trillion? In situations with an uncertain payoff, economists often talk about the concept of expected value. The basic idea is that you multiply the value of each possible outcome with the probability of that outcome occurring. For example, if I'm going to flip a coin and give you $10 only if it lands on heads, your expected value is $10 times 50%, or 0.5, which equals $5. The actual payouts are only ever going to be $0 or $10, but if you were to play this game many times, you'd receive on average $5 per play. Now in the case of voting, we have a tiny probability that your single vote flips the election, multiplied by a huge monetary consequence, the shaping of the federal budget. Rearranging a little, it's just one huge number divided by another. And human beings have a notoriously bad intuition about large numbers. Quick, how much would your vote be worth if the amount of money at stake were $500 billion, and the chances of being a deciding vote were 1 in 17 million? Or what if $25 billion were at stake, and the chances of being a decisive vote were 1 in 2 trillion? I think for many of us, we see two enormous numbers, our eyes glaze over, and they just kind of cancel out. But actually, in the first case, your vote would be worth almost $30,000, and in the second case, it would be worth a little over a cent. So this numerator and this denominator make a big difference. It's the difference between your vote being a precious gem and your vote being a discarded penny on the street. So which is it? Well, unsurprisingly, the answer is complicated. So let's dig in, shall we? Oh, real quick. I'm making a number of simplifying assumptions in this video. For instance, I'm just considering the race for president and imagining that the legislative branch more or less follows suit. I'll try to point out some other assumptions as we go, and I'm sure you'll let me know about some others in the comments. Okay, so let's start by just naively dividing the entire federal budget by the number of voters. This is problematic on multiple levels, but it's a starting point. In 2023, the government spent $6.1 trillion, and in the most recent presidential election, 155 million people voted. Dividing those numbers, we get a value of $39,354 per voter? That's insane, right? Well, maybe it's not totally ridiculous, in the sense that it's probably within an order of magnitude of how much you pay in taxes. But on the other hand, if people really felt this much money were at stake for them personally, voter turnout would be at 100%. So what are we missing here? Well, as I mentioned before, the whole federal budget isn't at stake, really. For example, regardless of who wins, a decent chunk of the federal budget goes into paying interest on the national debt. So we'll need some way of getting at how much of the federal budget is truly at play politically, how much spending varies depending on who's in power. I also hear some of you screaming into your screens that, for the most part, the federal budget is spent on other people. It's not like any of the candidates are promising to personally deposit $1 trillion into your bank account, and I suspect that there might be some pushback from everyone else if they did. So how do we quantify the value to you of government spending that mostly goes to other people? Well, let's do a little thought experiment. I can either give $100 to you or to one of your neighbors that you don't know very well. What would you choose? Or what if it were $10 to you versus $100 to your neighbor? A dollar? A penny? If you chose to take a penny over giving $100 to one of your neighbors, congratulations, you're a sociopath. On the other hand, if you passed up the full $100, well, you're a better person than me. I think for most of us, the truth lies somewhere in between. For me, if the other person is truly anonymous, the decision changes somewhere around $10. And there's been a fair amount of research to back up a value somewhere in this range. So for the rest of this video, since almost all of government revenue and spending involves other people, we'll reduce whatever number we come up with by a factor of 10. Your personal number may vary. Anyway, returning to our questionable fraction, the other problem is that it's just not really accurate to divide by the total number of voters, right? Probabilities are complicated, and just because there are 150 million voters doesn't mean that your chances of swaying the election are 1 in 150 million. So we'd better look into that too. Okay, so let's start by trying to figure out just how much of the federal budget is truly at play depending on the outcome of the election. Getting a precise number will be tricky, maybe impossible, but let's start by narrowing our focus based on spending category. I started by downloading some historical data from the Office of Management and Budget. One of these tables, attractively entitled Outlays by Superfunction and Function, showed how much money was spent in a bunch of different categories from 1940 all the way through to 2029? I guess it includes some projected budgets. Anyway, for this video, I focused just on the years 1980 to 2023. Recent enough to feel relevant, but not so recent as to literally be in the future. Eliminating certain categories, like interest payments on debt, was fairly straightforward, because surely that wouldn't be political, right? I also chose to exclude some more insulated categories like Social Security and Medicare, as well as military spending, although I can certainly think of arguments for including those. Ultimately, I landed on these 8 categories, doing my best to select those whose year-to-year fluctuations could easily be construed as political in nature. I will say that it became quickly clear to me how insanely complicated the federal budget is, and how little I truly understood it. So if you're an expert, please feel free to roast me in the comments, and enlighten us all in the process. Actually, that reminds me, can we do our best to upvote experts in the comments, and downvote people who are talking out their butts? Thanks in advance. Anyway, let's assume that I did a passable job, perhaps overcounting in some places and undercounting in others, and let's look at a graph of how the sum of all of these categories has changed since 1980. Whoa. Okay, so spending has gone up. But a significant chunk of this is an illusion, both because of inflation and because of the general growth of the US economy, which scales everything up. To counteract both of these effects, I divided the total for each year by the GDP for that year. That's a little bit more reasonable. Now let's remember what we're actually trying to figure out here. How much of this is actually at play from year to year based on the actions of our elected officials? If the graph were more or less flat, like this, things would be fairly clear. This amount of money would be spent pretty much every year, and this range right here would represent the year-to-year variability, the money that's at stake based on who wins the election. But in reality, there still seems to be some amount of upward trend in spending, so we need to detrend the data. As a rough approximation, I did what's called a linear regression, which models this graph as a straight line going up at a particular angle. From there, we can look at something called the standard error of the regression, which measures the variability above and below this trend line. This is exactly what we're interested in. But you might notice that there's something not very linear about the years 2020 through 2022. Something happened in those years, I kind of blocked it out to be honest, but it involved an enormous amount of government spending on income security. To account for these outlier years, we can use something called a dummy variable, and if we do so, we get this much more modest linear trend. Of course, you can certainly make the argument that this COVID spending should be counted as political. But I'm going for a more conservative estimate of the value of your vote, so we'll treat it as an outlier that would have led to massive spending regardless of who was in power. So, what was the standard error after accounting for COVID as an outlier? Well, it's about plus or minus 0.962% of GDP, or plus or minus $259.5 billion. That's a range of $519 billion. And that's per year, so since the next chance to change course is the midterm elections 2 years later, we should really multiply this by 2, yielding a total of $1.038 trillion in federal spending. It's no $6.1 trillion, but it's still a heck of a lot of money. Okay, before we leave this section, I have to point out all of the ways that this number doesn't capture the true monetary value of different administrations. First of all, I'm looking at just the sum of these categories, but overlooking spending changes between the categories. And those could be a big deal. Also, even the same amount of money spent on the exact same category can have a different effect depending on who's in charge of the relevant agency. And all of these agencies are headed by political appointees. Finally, it's worth mentioning that, even if all you care about is money, judicial appointments matter too, since their decisions can have major economic consequences. So as I said, it's kind of impossible to get a single number that captures all of the nuances of how politics affects government spending. But I think that this $1.038 trillion number gives a reasonably accurate sense of scale. Having settled on a value for the numerator, it's time to talk about the denominator, the unlikelihood that your vote literally decides the election. Intuitively, I felt like the probability that your vote is decisive would approach zero pretty darn fast. But how fast? Well, let's start with a thought experiment. Say we flip 100 coins. What's the probability that exactly half of them are heads and half of them are tails? Well, it's the number of different ways of getting a 50-50 split divided by the total number of ways of flipping 100 coins. If you remember your combinatorics from high school, the number of ways of getting a 50-50 split is 100 choose 50, and the number of ways of flipping 100 coins is 2 to the 100. These are two truly enormous numbers, but when we divide them, we get 0.0796, or about 8%, which is noticeably higher than 1 in 100. So what if we use more coins? Well, it turns out that this probability actually trends with 1 over the square root of the number of coins, approaching the square root of 2 over pi n. This means that even with 1,000,000 coin flips, the chances of a tie is actually only about 1 in 1,000. Kind of surprising, huh? It starts to make you wonder why we haven't heard about more tied elections. Well, one reason for this is that actual elections aren't really like coin flips. See, we know ahead of time that coin flips are 50-50. But in an actual election, voters' true preferences are unknown. All we have is a kind of probability distribution based on polling data. And it turns out that this difference makes the probability of a tied vote proportional to 1 over n instead of 1 over root n. In a really close election, this might be 20 over n, whereas in a less close election, it might be more like 2 over n. But in general, with millions of voters, your chances will be somewhere on the order of 1 in 1,000,000. Luckily, we can be more precise, because when it comes to US presidential elections, people have looked into this. A study of the 2008 presidential election by Andrew Gelman, Nate Silver, and Aaron Edlin, featuring repeated electoral college simulations, found that the average national probability of your vote being decisive was 1 in 60 million. Of course, the probability varied considerably depending on where you voted. In a large, decidedly liberal state like New York, the chances were more on the order of 1 in a billion, whereas in a contentious swing state, the chances got as low as 1 in 10 million. By the way, I actually found this kind of confusing at first, because sure, 1 in 60 million is like a lottery ticket, but in every election, 100 million people play that lottery. So why have we never had a tied result? You might pause and think about it for a second. Well, the reason is because if one person's vote is decisive, it necessarily means that everyone else's vote in that state is decisive too. We're not playing the lottery individually, we're playing the lottery collectively. And if we ever do win big, every single person's vote in the tied state would be worth $1 trillion. Anyway, now that we have our denominator, let's finally calculate the expected value of your vote. Returning to our calculation of expected value, your vote is worth $1.038 trillion, divided by 10 because all of that money is spent on other people, divided by 60 million, the probability that your vote actually decides the election. Running that through a calculator, your vote is worth exactly $1,730.27. That's a lot of money. Of course, if you live in New York, we need to divide by 1 billion instead of 60 million, so your vote is worth only about $100. Bummer, but still not nothing. Oh, and if you live in a swing state, then your vote is worth exactly $10,381.60. That's like 10 Sky Mall Cat Serenity Pods. But seriously, especially if you live in a swing state, your vote is precious, and anyone who's trying to persuade you that it's not is probably doing so precisely because it is. And remember, this $10,000 has already been discounted by a factor of 10 because the money doesn't go to you directly. But you could also think of it as a $100,000 charitable contribution. For me personally, the process of making this video has really put into perspective the value of phone banking. See, every time there's an election, I struggle to convince myself to phone bank, because I get anxious talking to strangers on the phone, and how many votes am I really going to sway anyway? 1, maybe 2? But if those 1 or 2 votes are worth $10,000 a pop, that really starts to change the way I look at it. Also, for those of you doing the hard work of community organizing, let me give you another number. See, that same paper from Gelman, Silver, and Edlin estimated that a swing of 500 votes from one candidate to the other in a swing state would have a 1 in 6,000 chance of swinging the national election. Applying the same calculations as before, the expected value of a coordinated community effort to swing 500 votes is worth a staggering $17.3 million. $173 million if you set aside the altruism discount of 1/10. So if any of you trying to help people to the polls in Georgia are watching this, thank you. Even from a mercilessly economic perspective, your work is so valuable. So what are you going to do with your one wild and precious vote? Well, what I hope you've taken away from this video is that However unlikely your vote is to actually decide the election, that probability is nothing compared to the absolutely staggering amount of government spending on the table. And as a result, your vote is like a free lottery ticket, worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars. To claim that lottery ticket today, which is to say register to vote, check out the links in the video description. I also put links for how you can get involved in the Harris campaign, in case phone banking is taking on a new meaning to you too. Oh, and if you want more videos like this, well, I can't really say that you should subscribe to this channel. Mostly this channel is about the intersection of music, math, and coding. My next video is probably going to be about music on a Mobius strip. So if that sounds interesting to you, hit subscribe and click the bell to make sure you see it. Also, you might have noticed several moments in this video where I pointed to extra detail on Patreon. Whenever I make an in-depth video like this, there are interesting details that don't quite make the final cut. So for this video, I'm throwing those details into an extended version on Patreon. I hope you'll check it out and help sustain my work in the process.